Hey, everybody, and welcome back to another edition of the Security Ledger podcast. My name's Paul Roberts. I'm the host and the editor-in-chief here at Security Ledger. Today on the podcast, we're taking a closer look at what I think is one of the fastest growing areas of cyber risk and one that we don't understand so well, which is attacks that are targeting edge devices. Firewalls, VPN gateways, load balancers, anything kind of publicly facing internet appliances, they've become a really huge target for cyber criminals and nation state actors in the last few years. And according to new research from GreyNoise, the problem isn't just that these systems are being attacked, it's that many organizations really lack the ability to be able to detect what's happening and protect or secure those devices until it's too late. My guest today is Nishawn Smagh, who's the Director of Threat Intelligence at GreyNoise. And Nishawn, welcome to the Security Ledger podcast.
Thanks, Paul. I appreciate the opportunity. I'm excited about this. I agree with you. It's an area that decision makers and practitioners need to pay closer attention to.
Absolutely. So for folks who aren't aware or haven't heard of GreyNoise before, could you just tell us a little bit about what GreyNoise does and also, of course, about what you do at GreyNoise?
Yeah, of course. So GreyNoise, we provide visibility on attacks targeting edge infrastructure. So things like EDR that exist for networks, those type of things don't exist for edge infrastructure.
Mm-hmm.
So we provide visibility on that. So as a cyber threat intelligence company, we employ a fleet of honeypot sensors across the globe, 5,000 honeypots deployed across 80 countries. And with these honeypots, we're able to collect mass scanning and mass exploitation of things targeting edge infrastructure. As we collect information, we bring it back, we process it, we classify IP and the behavior of that IP as malicious, suspicious, or benign. And then we disseminate that to our customers through a couple of different means to help both commercial and government customers identify and prioritize targeted threats, detect compromised devices, identify malicious traffic, support them through dynamic blocklists as well, which is really the way to keep up from a speed perspective right now with the way that infrastructure is rapidly rotating, and essentially separating signal from noise so that defenders understand what is actually a threat at their network edge.
So honeypots, this is not a new concept in cybersecurity, right? Honeypots are systems that are set up by defenders to look like attractive targets to potential attackers so that you can get them in an environment that you control rather than one that they control, or give them access to an asset that is not sensitive so that you can detect that they're there. How is that useful for companies to have access to honeypot data?
As we collect this data from our honeypots, with those sensors, we're able to have them emulate different types of edge devices. One day it can look like Palo Alto, next day Cisco, then F5, it could be a firewall, it could be VPN, et cetera. And so it's responsive to the threat environment. So as a malicious actor is conducting mass scanning exploitation, we're collecting that information. That is helping organizations discern what is targeting everyone at large versus what is targeting them directly. And so by a process of elimination, they can determine this is the guy at my network edge, or this is the threat at my network edge who's jiggling the door handle. Do I want to let him in or not? And so it's certainly has applications from a defensive perspective to make sure that malicious actor can't open the door into your network. And then also from a decision-making perspective, how much risk does an organization want to assume with the footprint of internet-facing edge devices that they have that could be compromised by a malicious actor?
Why are hackers suddenly so focused on edge devices? And we've always talked about the perimeter, right? That's where often attacks begin. But what's different now? Why are attackers suddenly so focused on edge devices?
So a trend that exists is like there's always been a focus, but been cyclical from a malicious actor. We're in a part of the threat where there is a large focus by malicious actors to go after edge devices. So if you look at the trend data from the past year, Verizon DBR report from 2025, so there was an 8 times increase year over year in targeting edge infrastructure. Google Threat Intelligence, through their lens, 23% of their 0 days affecting network and security appliances. CrowdStrike, that China-linked attackers, targeted edge devices in 40% of their intrusion-related cases. So we're starting to see another trend where malicious actors are going after edge infrastructure because it's essentially the soft underbelly of an organization's network. Again, things like EDR don't exist for edge infrastructure. And so there's a lack of visibility on what IP address is exhibiting what behavior or jiggling the door handles to your network.
These are routers, VPN gateways, hardware these are not traditional desktop or laptop endpoints or servers that might have an EDR solution on them. They're more specialized than that.
It expands beyond that too. So yes, VPNs, routers, firewalls, like those are what big organizations have. We also have visibility on residential capabilities, routers, CCTV cameras that could be compromised as well. Like just some other examples of different types of edge devices. The most recent edge device that's getting introduced now is large language models. Large language models are designed to be internet facing so that customers can operate with them effectively. The challenge is, from a cybersecurity perspective, for a long time, we traded speed for security. My concern
Arguably, we're still doing it.
My concern is we're continuing to do that with large language models. And so I think there are some lessons learned we can take from the last 12 years where, yes, we want to achieve speed, but security has to come with it. So, and that's not just for large language models. That goes for all types of devices that are internet facing because they're designed to be interacted with. The challenge is malicious actors can use it as a gateway.
You mentioned the residential edge devices, residential proxies. In your report, you noted, GreyNoise, that you recorded 300,000 IPs that participated in a credential spraying campaign, and 73% of the total botnet was residential IPs. What types of things are we talking about here? Are these all broadband routers or?
These are the typical routers that we each use in our homes. These are the typical routers that small businesses use.
Yeah.
And so that botnet that you're talking about, it grew from just a few thousand IPs up to 300,000 IPs in just a matter of a few months. And so the sheer scale at which it could grow, that's what really creates a challenge. And that's one of the key signals that we look for is the scale of the infrastructure that's being used. And so, homes, small offices, like essentially they're being weaponized to execute remote desktop.
And what's your sense of how the malicious actors are getting access to these? Are they simply, it's like with NotPetya, right? Just using default admin username and password that might be in the documentation to get access, or are there ODays, or are there known vulnerabilities in the firmware? What's the method?
I say it's a little bit of all the above. So I think the simple way is default passwords. So those default passwords for different type of home and small business routers, those things get public. An easy thing to do is just change the default password, but don't change it to password 1234 because those types of passwords can be cracked when there's a credential spraying campaign, something like that, or a brute force attack. Some of those things can get cracked. From an intel perspective, the interesting thing that we are seeing from these residential proxies is that they are predominantly conducting mass scanning. These are not the IPs that are doing the exploitation of a device, right? They're conducting the mass scanning. Challenge of it from an intel perspective is that these IPs rotate so quickly. essentially vanish before a reputation can be determined with regards to that particular IP that is acting in a malicious behavior, that particular IP. So by the time a reputation flags that residential IP, the malicious behavior has already rotated to a new address. And then it's the common IP that's coming out of that router that's common purposeful traffic.
Right.
So from GreyNoise perspective, we're not only focused on the IP, we're focused on the behavior behind the IP. And so while the infrastructure can quickly rotate, the fingerprints, the tools that these malicious actors use, those do not rotate at the same speed and scale. And so we're able to determine the behavior behind the IP and track the behavior as they rapidly rotate through infrastructure.
Which is a shift from the kind of traditional approach of blacklisting compromised IP addresses and blocking them based on that. But as you pointed out in the State of the Edge report, more than half of the remote code execution attempts that you guys observed came from IPs that you had no history of, right? Had never seen before. Right.
Yeah. And so the challenge with that is your static block lists are just not going to.
Right.
The organizations updating their block list 14 or 30 days, they are a huge disadvantage, and they're assuming a bunch of risk, and they may not understand that risk they're assuming. One of the things that GreyNoise does is we provide dynamic block lists. So as we are observing this mass scanning exploitation and classifying that behavior, a customer of ours can write a block list command that communicates with their firewall. We update that at speed to help them keep up with the rapid changeover in IP infrastructure.
And in terms of the underlying problems here, I think one of them, just looking at your research, would clearly be what some people refer to as code rot, right? Old, vulnerable code that is residing within these devices. And one kind of data point there is you found that CVEs from 2015 or earlier generated more than 4 times more sessions than CVEs from 2023 and 2024. That there is just a real prominence of hackers exploiting really known and old vulnerabilities in these devices. Talk a little bit about that. And is that a reflection of just failure to update firmware, end of life devices that are just not patchable, but still deployed because they basically still work? Like what's the underlying issue there with all this old code being exploited by attackers on these edge devices?
So there's 2 sides to that. From a network perspective, there are a number of end of life devices that are just not receiving their support anymore. And so there's no patching that's happening for those types of devices. Although vulnerabilities exist on those documented vulnerabilities. From an attacker's perspective, economically, it makes sense. Continue to go after these older exploits because they're stable, they're reliable, and they're free, right? And so instead of spending time on the latest and greatest code and trying to crack your way through it, let me go back
to some ODay or something, right?
So yeah, the patching programs, the concern is the patching programs, they're optimized for recency. That's how a lot of organizations address this. One of the things that just came out from CISO was the operational directive 26-04, which placed a prioritization on security updates based on risk, right? And so it doesn't matter when that CVE was published or what device it's against. It's what is the risk that's being assumed by a government agency by not securing this edge device. Right. And that's something that GreyNoise can help with, both our government and commercial customers, is understanding what is getting exploited in the wild right now.
Right.
That can help you make risk-based decisions and allocate resources to solve those types of problems.
On the end of life devices, are these devices that companies, are they even aware of their end of life and just have said, we'll deal with it, we'll replace it eventually? Or are they really maybe not even cognizant of the fact that this is unsupported software?
There's probably a mix of the two. So when we talk to different organizations, one of the questions we ask them is, do you have an inventory of all your edge devices? Many companies do not have a full inventory of their edge devices. So they don't have a great idea of what that even looks like. They don't know what their attack surface looks like. That's assuming risk and not understanding the risk you're assuming.
And the companies themselves may not be communicating with them in a proactive way about saying, hey, you're still using this device, it's not supported, and so on.
I'm not aware of that happening. Something that may be useful is if companies, as they sold these things at different retailers, put a sticker on it and just said, hey, this thing will be supported through this date. That at least informs an organization, or for you and I at our homes, this thing will be good to go for a period of time. After that, I need to look for another solution.
You, in the research you did on the State of the Edge report, you found a concentration of exploits targeting certain platforms. Palo Alto Global Protect was at the top of the list, MikroTik routers, and then attacks targeting Cisco SSL VPN. Does that shift from year to year in terms of what assets attackers are targeting? And do we have any sense of how they're figuring out what assets to target? I would imagine it has to do with how many of them there are, how widely deployed they are. But I don't know what are your thoughts on why particular Palo Alto, Cisco, MikroTik, how do they end up on that list?
To your latter point, what we saw was a much higher percentage of targeting going after Palo Alto Protect. When we ran the numbers, it's not relative to market share. And so there's a focus on malicious actor going after Palo Alto Global Protect. Again, when we did this study, we looked at 6 months worth of data. And so what I'd be curious to learn is the answer to your question of how does this change over time? Because as defenders put options in place to secure, malicious actors will respond with a change in their TTPs as well. In recent reporting, we're seeing a lot of mass scanning against VPNs in particular. And so that is a focus that malicious actors certainly have. We see, say, a healthy number of attacks targeting firewalls and routers, things of that nature as well. But the sheer numbers of Palo Alto stuck out because the number of sessions, which is the interactions with our honeypots, it was more than both Cisco and Fortinet combined. That kind of jumped out at us that, okay, wow, in this period, malicious actors went after this type of VPN device at a much higher degree than others.
Does that tend to correlate with, CVE 2026, whatever was published on this date, and it's a 9 or 10 severity remote code execution vulnerability, and then you see that? Or is it, we don't know, maybe there's some 0-day that hasn't been discovered that's being used, or just they've found some way to get access to these devices? Is there a correlation there?
That's what we're trying to figure out now. We have done a couple of studies, particularly focused on early warning. And so as we went through this analysis, we did some retro hunts. When in some of the key markers in that retro hunt, we wanted to understand, when did the CVE get disclosed? And did we see evidence before that CVE was disclosed within our collect that could serve as an early warning opportunity, right? So we've gone through a couple iterations of this analysis, and we're starting to recognize a couple like key early warning triggers that are leading us down this path of thinking, hey, we may be able to provide an early warning signal to organizations that a particular type of edge device is being exploited. This is the type of vulnerability it's trying to exploit. Those two key triggers is the volume of IPs, which is the infrastructure that's being used, and then the volume of sessions at the same time, which is really the intensity of the target. Those are the two key ones. There's a couple other figures that we need to continue to do the analysis on, have them play out to see if they prove true. But right now, those two key features, IP volume and session volume, are two key triggers that we focus in on. So after we published the State of the Edge report, we did another report on early warning called 10 Days Before Zero. So we started looking at these triggers from a retro hunt perspective, understand the lessons learned, apply that towards our early warning capability. We were seeing in our collect just a few weeks ago, and we produced a blog on this, that there was activity occurring that was targeting Sonic Wall VPNs. And so we put the blog post out there, and then Huntress, a player in the cybersecurity community, said that, hey, based off GreyNoise reporting, we're able to see that 6 different organizations are now compromised through this vulnerability with Sonic VPN. So that was a badge for GreyNoise. Okay, we're starting to get down this path where we're not predicting the vulnerability. We're helping describe how the environments typically look before a vulnerability is disclosed. And so we're able to see that scanning. We're able to see that brute force activity, the remote code execution, right? When we see these things with different IPs and session volumes, now we're starting to key in on the real signal from an early warning threat.
It's like the tide receding ahead of the tsunami, right?
Yes, that's a good early warning signal. And you start running for the hills.
That's right. That's right. Really interesting. What I know you mentioned, like with the Palo Alto attacks, that the vulnerability that was most targeted was this 6-year-old CVE 2020-2034 PAN-OS injection flaw. This does speak a little bit to software maintenance and software management. Is the sense you get that just customers out there just have not applied the latest versions of Palo Alto's updates? They're just, it's just low on their list of things to do. And that's why these 6-year-old flaws continuing to wreak havoc? Or what's your sense about what's driving 2026? We're still seeing a 6-year-old vulnerability used to hack all these devices. Or is that still in the code and unfixed?
It could be both, honestly.
Yeah.
So it's in my experience working with different customers, it's defenders, we are slow to patch.
Yeah.
And sometimes other priorities take over.
Yeah.
And the patch may not ever take place. Right? Because other priorities take over. And so it could be an example like that where
selling software, right?
Where a vulnerability that was 5 years old still got hammered with almost 4 million sessions against this particular vulnerability.
Yeah. Can we talk about AI?
Of course. We have to talk about AI.
I was going to say requirement. What do you see as the impact of AI, both on the exploitation side and also on the recon side, on the work that you all are doing at GreyNoise? Do you see a change in behavior on the, just in your monitoring, that you could say, I think some of this is being driven by AI and automation?
So AI is both a wonderful opportunity and a threat. It all depends on how you want to use it. So from an offensive perspective, being able to employ an AI capability to get after vulnerabilities will allow you to significantly increase your speed and scale. Okay. Defenders right now are already challenged with keeping up at speed with malicious cyber actors. On the offensive side, they're just going to continue to accelerate. So it's imperative on the defensive side to make use of that same type of technology to defend those networks at speed. There's a couple key things that are needed there. One is data to train the large language models, to understand what is a threat and what is not a threat. Now, one of the concerns that I have is many large language models who are being trained to do SOC security are being trained on data post-compromise. They're not being trained on data prior to compromise. And so the large language model is being trained to understand the scene of the crime instead of anticipating the crime. So one of the things that I've advocated for is for organizations to utilize data from, or cyber threat intelligence data, focus on edge infrastructure to understand what is the behavior your large language model should be looking for to discern a malicious threat versus a benign actor.
It's the type of thing you were just talking about where, okay, we're seeing this pattern of behavior that we can't totally explain, but it seems to correlate. And then lo and behold, yeah, actually that was an early signal of malicious activity regarding the sonic wall devices. I've heard this, other people say this too, which is, should we be training AI on the approach to security that we've used for the last 20 or 30 years, which is very reactive and human focused in its design? Or is there some whole other kind of next level security that AI might make possible by just saying, yeah, doesn't necessarily need to do what we've been doing. Maybe it can do something bigger and better and more, right?
Yeah, my opinion is we have to change. So the human focus defender approach has always been reactive.
Reactive, right.
Here's the challenge. So defenders move at the speed of disclosure. Malicious actors move at the speed of discovery. And so we have to find a way to give defenders an opportunity to see the threat before it materializes, right? So I go back to the early warning aspect of this, and we can talk more about our early warning study in particular, but we have to move away from human-centric towards agentic AI that can help flag, triage, and enable decision-making. I would also advocate that we need to keep a human in the loop for those decisions that have a lot of consequence, but it's based on an organization to determine what is that degree of consequence where a human now needs to weigh in versus a machine with a set of rules.
It's the Skynet problem.
Yeah. So one of the other things with regards to AI, we do see targeting of large language models within GreyNoise data. And this came out in the State of the Edge report, but we saw basically two different campaigns that really caught our eye. One was in the fall timeframe of 2025, where there were 91,000 sessions that were targeting large language model infrastructure, such as Olama servers. And then over the holiday period, really an 11-day period, there was a sprint campaign where we saw 83,000 sessions. The interesting thing about that was that in 99% of the attack traffic, it shared the same JA4 fingerprint. So that's how we identify behavior, the tooling.
Explain that briefly. Just
JA4 is one of many different ways to classify, to basically do network fingerprinting. It's a method that's used to identify and classify behavior. With ours, it's a JA4, so we're classifying HTTP, so unsecure internet. And with those JA4 signatures, we're able to cluster the internet scanning that we're seeing. And based on that clustering and the behavior, we can discern the intent of the activity behind that IP address, and also separate malicious activity from benign activity. And so when we talk to different organizations, many are focused on IP reputation. That is not the way to go anymore because of the rapid infrastructure turnover. But if you focus on the JA4 fingerprints, that allows you to understand specific applications and browsers that are being used, detect malware, potentially C2 traffic. It can improve, and really what this is, improves threat hunting and anomaly detection. So that it helps helps SOC defenders understand, okay, what's actually, again, jiggling that door handle at their network edge. But that's one of the key features that we focus on is the JA4 fingerprint, so we can discern the behavior as we run the static or the dynamic block list. Yes, block this IP because right now it's behaving in a malicious way. We know this because of the behavior it's exhibiting. but we use JA4 as a way to get after.
Do you have time for two more questions?
Yeah, of course.
So I think one of the tricky things here is, let's just look at enterprise IT. This problem has two kind of aspects to it from your organization. One is your own edge devices that are exposed to attackers, like securing those, tracking those, being aware of them, and monitoring them. Obviously, we look at things like Colonial Lifeline compromise, right? That came by way of a VPN gateway, a compromised user account, and so on. And then, as you're pointing out, there's also just from the monitoring, from the inbound attacks and risks, you also need to be aware of this larger population of compromised edge devices that could be used to facilitate attacks against your infrastructure, compromise your network and your data, and so on. What would your advice be to talking to a CISO? How should they prioritize their actions and response to this risk?
Yeah, so we documented that in the State of the Edge report. And the way that we broke it down was, what should CISOs and SOC defenders do now? What should they do in the next 90 days? And what should they do within 180 days, right? Try to help prioritize this based off the threat. So the couple examples of things that they can do now: enforce multi-factor authentication on all edge devices, right? That's something you can
Simple.
be put in place. Right. It's simple, but not all organizations can afford that. Small businesses may not be able to afford it. That is a way to secure yourself. If you're an organization that has deployed a large language model, audit that infrastructure for exposure, right? So it's the security aspect of that. All organizations should review their firmware currency. When was the last update? On the previous conversation we had, is this an end-of-life system? It's not getting firmware updates anymore. Those are a couple of things that can be done now that would help.
There's a report that came out particularly about that end-of-life device risk and telling organizations to get on top of it.
Yeah, the operational directive, 2602, right? Until CISO was directing U.S. federal agencies to get rid of those end-of-life devices. They're not supported. It is a security concern. So yeah, a couple of things that we suggested or recommended to do within 90 days is to develop a way to evaluate behavioral detection. That's the key thing. And I think I've hit that point several times. There's another thing you can do within 90 days. It's looking at ASN blocking. So in the State of the Edge report, we did a little bit of a deep dive on what networks were the most malicious, had the most malicious activity originating from them. And so that could be a means for organizations to block, is base it off of ASN. And if you go into GreyNoise, if you got questions, there's different ways that you can slice and dice the block lists. You can do it on a particular vulnerability. You can do it based off IP. It could be ASN. There's a number of different ways to set up that dynamic block list. And then for 180 days out, we recommended that SOCs determine and assess their ability to detect residential proxies. And then again, based on that behavior, integrate JA4 fingerprinting into their SOC workflows, again, to understand the behavior, because the infrastructure rotates so rapidly. So a couple suggestions that we provided, but they're in the report as well.
Okay, final question. This question around edge device risk brings up larger questions, right? Which is really around structural risks in our current IT infrastructure, right? Cloud, traditional IT, critical infrastructure. What are your thoughts? Who should be responsible for securing the internet? Should it fall to the vendors? Should it fall to enterprises, ISPs? Should the government be taking a bigger role? What are your thoughts?
That's the $1 million question. So
I think it's a $1 trillion question.
Trillion, yeah. So I would say from a government commercial partnership perspective, there's basically the approach is the government is responsible for deterrence and the commercial sector is responsible for resilience of networks. Okay. What I would suggest is a closer partnership of how do we get the government and commercial sectors to integrate those capabilities so that one supports the other? Because it still feels like two efforts in parallel. as far as who should secure the internet, an easy solution would be for the internet service providers to get involved, but that would require to monitor the ones and zeros traversing all the fiber networks. But they are in the business of moving ones and zeros, right? So it's probably not something that is necessarily supportive of their business goals. And then you also potentially run into First Amendment issues as well with regards to monitoring data and things of that nature.
More security means more monitoring and more granular understanding of what's traversing your network. And yeah, right, there is a cost to that. Right.
An idea like that, like a pie in the sky idea, I think there are practical things that we can do right now. And one of those is educating the population on what does the cyber threat really look like. And so that's talking to kids in school, talking to parents, there's community forums, things of that nature, and just helping them understand what is a healthy cyber security footprint. So again, I go back to the routers, change your default password. If we can educate them on what those types of threats look like and how they're leveraging those things, I think we just need to do a much better job of education with regards to cyber, because I don't have the sense that the average American truly appreciates the threat.
Absolutely not. Right. That router is sitting next to their TV or in their basement or something, and the lights blink, Netflix comes up, and that's all that matters. Are the Chinese on it? Yeah, maybe, but it doesn't really affect them. And yet it has a huge impact on public health and wellness and safety and so on.
Sure.
Really interesting. Nishawn, is there anything I didn't ask you that you wanted to talk about?
So I just wanted to hit a little bit more on the early warning analysis that we're doing, because I think for both our government commercial customers, this is something that would be extremely useful because it's going to help them anticipate threats. So as I mentioned earlier, we had gone through 2 different analytic efforts for this. And there's a couple triggers, IP volume, session volume, that are really showing themselves as helpful signatures of understanding the environment prior to disclosure. A couple facts and figures with this. So as we went through the analysis, we had over 50% of the surges in IPs and sessions, they preceded the CVEs. We had an early warning signal at a median of 11 days. So that's 11 days to give a SOC defender an opportunity to brief leadership, stage patches, and harden their network. That is a key 11 days, because typical patching is taking place after disclosure and may occur 2 to 4 weeks after that. And so that's a large window of risk. If GreyNoise in the cybersecurity community can produce an early warning capability, that is an opportunity for defenders to maintain speed with the adversary. Along with that, now that Mythos is out, there are other large language models that are going to develop similar capabilities in the coming months. And so the concern in the community is there's just going to be an onslaught of vulnerabilities that are getting identified, right? The question is, which of those will be exploited? So from a GreyNoise perspective, relative to this early warning, having early warning of which vulnerabilities are going to be exploited based off of observed behavior, combined with static or with dynamic block lists, that is a way for defenders to maintain speed with a malicious actor. And so those are the types of opportunities that we're trying to take advantage of and support our customers with.
Yeah, because the current ecosystem is so reactive. The vulnerability gets disclosed. There's all media coverage, maybe a week or 10 days after that. CISO puts out some alert, but it's all, at this point, the horse has left the barn, right?
It also meets the intent of the administration's national cyber strategy to transition towards an active cyber defense.
Right.
After the threat, before it gets after you.
Right.
We're trying to produce those capabilities to do that. And right now, the analysis is looking very favorable towards that.
Sean, thank you so much for coming on and speaking to us on the Security Ledger podcast. It's really been a pleasure, and we will absolutely link to the State of the Edge report, the other recent reports you guys have done, and look forward to having you back on and talking.
Thanks, Paul. I appreciate it. It was good talking with you.